What's up, guys? So me and Colette, we made this presentation in our Asian philosophies class. It was talking about non-dualism. I think I really came to enjoy Daoism through this class, and I'm very thankful that I took this class so I could discover that I really enjoyed it. And I think this presentation does a good job of not only showing my appreciation for it, but also some work that me and Colette did that I'm proud of, which I think is cool. Even though I did record this presentation, first, fair warning, the audio is not the best, and I only started recording maybe like 15 minutes in. So I'll do a little talking, making sure we're all on the same page, and then we'll check back in with Colette when we get there. But yeah, I hope you enjoy all of... Okay, so a quick overview of our presentation. We kind of broke up this presentation into three main blocks. The first one being Western critiques of dualism. I think both me and Colette, just having done a lot of work with like Western philosophy and Western critical thought, the problem of dualism, especially the contemporary problem of dualism, is one that we've come across a lot, and through a lot of different classes as well. So it was really fun to start our presentation with this, because I think us both going in, this is something that we have a lot of control and a lot of time spent on. And so it was fun to kind of start with that and then kind of like lead into what can Daoism tell us about these problems with dualism. The second block is talking about kind of like Eastern critiques of dualism, and the word Eastern here, we're basically just talking about Taoist critiques of dualism. I don't think Colette or I are a fan of the dichotomy between the East and the West. Obviously, it's an anti-dualism presentation, but you know, you do what you have to for the sake of a good presentation. So yeah, we'll be talking about kind of like critiques of dualism and then kind of Taoist solutions as well. And we'll try to steelman all of these as good as possible, starting with Western stuff. We're not really going to go over Western solutions, but we'll steelman the critiques of dualism. We'll steelman the critiques of dualism for Taoism, and then we'll steelman the solutions that Daoism brings. And then we'll end with a criticism phase where we'll both kind of sit and talk about what we enjoy and don't enjoy about the solutions, the solutions that Daoism brings. So yeah, that's our overview. Okay, so now we get into some of the definitions that we're going to be using throughout this presentation. And our first definition, and the one that I didn't record, is talking about logocentrism. I'll be honest, this is a lot more of Colette's expertise, but we'll see if I can do it. So logocentrism is kind of this idea that we argue in the same way that dualism kind of persists in our modern world. Logocentrism is another one of these like guiding ideas that exists in the way Western ideology thinks about things. So logocentrism is it's ideas about ideas, and it's thinking about truth as something that exists independent of language, and in some way when we speak a truth, it is this independent thing. It is this thing that is created. It is this thing that is wholly by itself, right?
And we can rely on that are independent from other things. And what's really important to note here is that not only are they independent, but they're completely new. They can exist on their own, and they're totally separate from other ideas, with or without written and oral symbols that we use. And dualism is this thing that we're going to be criticizing today, and we think of it as more of like a mode of conceptualization of things. We think of that there's like a foundational assumption of dichotomies. Like, this is most famously like in the Cartesian sense, like mind-body dualism. You know, like I think, therefore I am. There's an inherent separation between mind and body here as kind of separate entities. But I argue also in logocentrism, there's also a dualism there of abstract ideas and language. there's something that makes writing in and of itself not inherently truth. There's a duality. There's an inherent divide between these abstract truths and these ideas and kind of the perversion of them by writing. Speech and writing are also fundamentally different under dualism. Writing, they think that the very nature of it in these like Western logocentrist ideas, true knowledge can never be extracted from this writing, and speech is kind of a more pure form of this. And there's something better than writing for that. And then finally, deconstruction is this movement that was, again, popularized by Jacques Derrida in the 60s. It's literally deconstructing the logic and assumptions used by these more Western texts, like literature and philosophy and, other studies, like in the language itself of those things. It's inherently anti-dualist, which is kind of easy to see. It's literally taking these walls or like these ideas and fully breaking them down into something more tangible. Okay. So Derrida has a lot of critiques of logocentrism, like I said, but his main one is that there is no independent truth out there at all. There's kind of this idea, like in the first quote, like the center is at the center of the totality, and yet since the center does not belong to the totality has its center elsewhere. And this seems really contradictory, but it's kind of saying that, like, since these ideas have centers, since something is encompassed, it is inherently separate from because of the fact that it is the center in the first place. I kept drawing this chart for Alex. It's a chart that I was drawn in a class about Spinoza, but I think it still applies here. This is like what logocentrism thinks. A, B, and C are totally unique, separate ideas from each other. There is no similarities between these things. But what deconstruction kind of does is not only show that there can be linear progressions between ideas, A causes B causes C, but there's actually everything causing and affecting each other at the same time. There's kind of no distinguishation between the causing and affecting and the newness or the independence of these ideas, because it's like fundamentally fake. But also, Derrida's critique of logocentrism comes a lot from language, because language is extremely a relative lens, right? I know this might be like a, well, duh, because like obviously what we learn and what we communicate with each other is influenced how we say it, but this is a pretty new idea at the time. The second quote says here that, like, meanings are products of particular historical periods and the subject positions of interpreters. In other words, they are products of what Foucault called the discursive practices of particular historical movements. It is not, then, that there is no truth in the world. Rather, such truth is always plural and historically contingent. I mean, think about the way we spoke even English 1,000 years ago versus 100 years ago versus 10 years ago versus 1 year ago. People are constantly changing the meanings and interpretations of words in such a way where language becomes something that is entirely relevant of the time and place that we even live in. And kind of this shows that, like, no idea can truly ever be fully abstract from one another. There is no way we can fully have independent truths out there that are not in any way affected by the time or place that they're from. It's kind of what I think the Chan Buddhism group was talking about, like with the rag. They were asked to like point out something totally independent, and somebody said this rag, but it was like, well, it's made out of cloth, which is made out of fibers, which is made out of this, which is made out of that. There's kind of no way to parse this down into a totally independent thing, which I think is what Derrida's kind of saying about ideas in the first place. And Derrida's solutions, this is kind of a trick question, because there actually is no solution. We always have to communicate in the relativity of language. In his view, we're kind of forever trapped in this cage that we're trying so hard to criticize. We can't transport these ideas in a way that will fundamentally make sense, again, 100, 1,000 years from now. Language is ever changing, but that's chaos to him. It's products of times and customs that we no longer can see or have. Again, English is constantly changing. So there's no real way that we can get rid of this logocentrism in his eyes. I think the second quote says it really well. The writer writes in a language and logic whose proper system, laws, and life, his discourse by definition cannot dominate absolutely. He uses them only by letting himself, after a fashion and up to a point, be governed by the system. At some point, we have to accept that we're all going to be governed by the system. There's kind of no way to escape this system that we've built for ourselves, as long as we communicate in language, which will probably be forever.
Yeah, so transitioning away from Derrida and towards Haraway, it's important that when we're looking at these critiques of dualism, we're kind of going to separate them into three distinct planes, or understand these three different critiques. They're a little different from each other. So the way I like to understand Derrida's is it's a very logical critique, right? He's coming and he's saying, that's just not how it is. We're drawing figures on the board. We're talking about logic and the use of language. Haraway is much more focused with maybe like the effects of dualism, or what she's going to call the domination of the other. So this first quote, certain dualisms have been persistent in Western traditions. They have all been systematic to the logics and practices of domination. Of women, people of color, nature, workers, animals. In short, domination of all constituted as others, whose task is to mirror the self. Chief among these dualisms, she's going to go on to name some: self, other, mind, body, culture, nature, male, female, civilized, primitive, reality, appearance, whole part, agent, resource, maker, made, active, passive, right, wrong, truth, illusion, total, partial, God, man. So what Haraway's doing is she's pointing out a lot of these specific dualisms that we see in our own life, these modes of conceptualization that we use in the West. And she's going to say these in some ways necessitate the domination that we see in our world today. These cause the domination that we see in our world today, and these justify the domination we see in the world today. Haraway likes to make things really difficult when she writes, so we're going to take some time to work through the second quote. But I think this helps us understand how Haraway's understanding these dualisms as related to each other, as necessary to each other, and necessary to the oppression of the other. The self is the one who is not dominated, who knows that by the service of the other. The other is the one who holds the future, who knows that by the experience of domination, which gives the lie to the autonomy of the self, right? So when we think of the self, right, we think of that self as being autonomous, as being different, as being absolutely separate from other things. But what Haraway is saying, that the other knows that this isn't true, that the other knows that this distinction of the self is predicated on the domination of the other. Continuing, to be one is to be autonomous, to be powerful, to be God. But to be one is to be an illusion, and so to be involved in a dialectic of apocalypse with the other. Right? So again, we're understanding that although the self wants to be its own entirely autonomous thing, it necessarily is not. It necessarily is predicated on the domination of the other. The other is aware of this. The other is aware of this illusion. The other is aware of this dialect of apocalypse. But the self tries to hide itself from it, right? Yet to be other is to be multiple, without clear boundary, frayed, insubstantial. One is too few, but two are too many.
Yeah. So basically what it's saying here is that dualism inherently creates this other that we see here in all of these different dualisms that we see in this first quote. By becoming otherized, it kind of both solidifies the other as inherently connected to its oppressor, but at the same time also works to make it small and oppressed. But if we try to ignore these dichotomies and ignore this otherness, it leaves you kind of as a lie. One is too few, but two is too many. It's impossible for us to be powerful to be God. Being one is overall, like she says, an illusion. We kind of dream of being whole and ending these dualisms by being this one, by only being the self that is not the other. But as you can see, that's totally impossible under what she says. Like, I think this and Derrida is pretty similar in the way that it critiques dualism as inherently fake by trying to hold these dichotomies in and of themselves. But at the same time, if we try to do that, ultimately we're kind of left in this system that we're circularly trying to escape over and over again. The cage of language and the cage of the one that we can point out, but we'll never really be free from.
Yeah. So moving on to our third critique of dualism in a Western perspective, we're going to look at Bruno Latour. And I think it's important to mention also that when we're talking about these Western perspectives, these are contemporary texts, right? We're not talking about modern philosophy here. We're talking about like late 20th century and early 21st century, right? Facing Gaia 2017. And Facing Gaia is a collection of lectures turned into a book that Latour gave. And Latour, unlike Derrida and Haraway, which are giving this broad critique of dichotomies and dualism, Latour is going to focus on one specific one, that being nature and culture. And I think why we chose to bring Latour into this conversation is because the nature-culture dichotomy is one that Daoism is constantly in conversation about. It is one that is at the primary forethought and an understanding of what Daoism is trying to bring to the world, right? So Latour is going to critique this nature-culture dichotomy that we create. He's going to say, the first quote, "The difficulty lies in the very expression relation to the world, which presupposes two sorts of domains, that of nature and that of culture," right? So I like to think of this when we're talking about ourselves, we may consider ourselves like culture, and then when we think of everything else besides ourselves, we're thinking of nature, right? These domains are domains that are at once distinct and impossible to separate completely, which means that we are not dealing with domains, but rather with one and the same concept divided into two parts, which turn out to be bound together, as it were, by a sturdy rubber band. So Latour is arguing that we're trying to make this distinction here, but they're necessarily two parts of the same thing, right? And they're always fundamentally bound together. In the Western tradition, we never speak of the one without speaking of the other. There is no other nature but this definition of culture, and no other culture but this definition of nature. Like almost necessarily, to describe what nature is, we have to use culture. And necessarily to describe what culture is, we have to use nature. And what Latour is saying here is on a logocentric level, we can see that these ideas are directly related together. They're one and the same. And dividing them only is like merely like illogical, right? But Latour's not also just going to critique it logically. Latour's also going to make some normative claim, particularly that by making this distinction, nature culture is placing normative claims into how we understand our world and how we understand our role in this world, right? Latour is writing in the context of the Anthropocene. He's writing in the context of trying to critique what we understand as anthropocentrism. This idea that in some way we're above or different or better than the rest of the world, right? Second quote, "When nature is involved, what is a matter of fact is necessarily also a matter of law. By making these distinctions, we're making normative claims. By pretending to oppose the two, we find ourselves with two forms of having to be, two moralities instead of one. What is just there is fundamentally also what is just. Or to put it in another way, to order in the sense of ordering the world is to order in the sense of giving orders. Necessarily, by creating these dualisms, we're creating a domination of the other. Necessarily, by critiquing dualism through the understanding of Derrida, the dualism also causes this kind of domination, right?"
Yeah. And I think it's also kind of important to point out the stakes of these arguments, not only in dualism in general, but also in this. Because I think it's really easy to like look at all the philosophy we're studying, or just like philosophy as a whole, and think of these only as these abstract ideas that we can never really extract anything from, or things that aren't really relevant to this world, because, you know, these are just a bunch of thinkers. They're sitting in the room, they're typing their little stuff, like, what do we care, right? But I think that the nature-culture divide is something where we can really see dualism come to life, for better and for worse, by thinking of ourselves as the other in terms of our relationship to nature, by thinking of ourselves as culture and putting culture on this pedestal. You can see the justification for how humans are treating nature in the status quo. I mean, it's definitely no secret that we've been destroying habitats and destroying nature ever since we've come to life. I'm not saying that humans like should totally be erased from the earth. I'm not advocating for eco-fascism right now, but I do think that this dualism kind of plays into that. And I also think the nature-culture divide talks about how we treat other people as well, not only how we treat nature itself. When I think of people who have been like civilizations and other peoples who have been criticized in the past by these structural systems like white supremacy, I think of people being labeled as uncivilized or barbaric or like beasts or animals, trying to further push them kind of into this other of nature, while again, kind of elevating the place of where culture is. So I think overall we can see that these dualisms do have tangible effects on our world. They're not just things that Alex and I are sitting up here and yapping about. There are things that actually have a full effect on the modern world that we live in. And again, these arguments are extremely contemporary. I mean, Derrida was from, the 60s? That's like 2 days ago in philosophy terms. And so there's just so much here, and it's so recent. And I think it is important to outline the stakes of this.
Yeah. And when we're looking at these problems, like these are all texts that me and Colette have like read and like really like worked with. And so the kind of like the question at the end is like, okay, it's fun to critique these things. What is the solution? And it's important to note here, like Derrida doesn't provide a solution, and we're not going to talk about Latour's solution, and we're not going to talk about Haraway's solution, purely from the stance that we don't like them, right? And so kind of coming into Daoism, kind of coming into this class, the goal for us is looking like, We're looking for solutions. Are there other perspectives in the world outside the block of Western philosophy that we can use to help us understand these problems that contemporarily we're coming to and that we need a solution to?
Yeah. So, we built in some discussion time. I would love if you guys could discuss for 10 minutes so Alex could register for his classes during this time. But do you guys buy these critiques? Do you have any thoughts on these Western problems / solutions? Why or not? Let us know what you think. We've been talking for a long time. Yeah.
Would you relate a lot of these ideas, like the Humean conception of like distinction? You know, like ideas that nothing is really separate, but it's really all just like everything is atomized distinctions. You know, like the nature-culture distinction doesn't actually exist. It's just a distinction created by language, right? That's what you're trying to say, right?
Yeah, I think it's somewhat similar to that. I wouldn't say it's like completely the same as like that anti-dualist argument, because I think a lot of what Hume talks about also is like things are necessarily connected, because like that's just how things like physically are in the world. It's like if I drop this water bottle, there's like it's going to drop because every other time I've dropped this water bottle, it's dropped, and just like learning from those experiences. And so I think it's not like entirely the same, especially in terms of like, again, like how experiences and how learning and how this idea of knowledge is. But I do think it's similar to what you're saying, like trying to deconstruct these like boundaries and this overall system of labeling ideas as completely separate from each other.
Yeah, I'm not super in tune with all this high-level philosophy stuff, so stop me if I'm way off track here. But I think it's interesting to think about. I think another way that you kind of touched on where we see this nature-culture distinction is in like the liberal international order, whereby like it's been naturalized as this order that is, you know, like civilized and culturally supreme and whatever. Like this is the way that the countries of the world and the people of the world should operate. And the naturalization of that distinction between nature and culture, I guess, sort of invites the assumption that its collapse will result in disorder. And so it's cool to see that, like, and interesting to think about the fact that that's just like not true and is a like discursive function of the separation between the two.
Yeah, that's spot on. That's what Latour is talking about in Facing Gaia. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's cool also in terms of like, I was thinking about like globalization and technology also in terms of like nature-culture divide. I think about like Elon Musk like bringing like Starlink and internet to like all of these like very remote tribes and kind of promoting himself as like, hey, like I'm giving these people all this knowledge and like I know better because I'm more cultured, so I will be their savior by like bringing them this technology. But as you can see, it's like that's not always true. One isn't always better than the other. Yeah.
And so I think for Haraway, the second philosopher, and I think overall I agree that dualism is problematic and that's how we conceptualize the world. But I was wondering why the Haraway thinks it's impossible to be one. Like, I think you talk about like illusion being. One is illusion, and like it's impossible to achieve. I think I think my question is like, is this person saying is it impossible as a society to be one because we kind of need to use the language to communicate with each other, or is it fundamentally impossible for us as a human being to do so because we cannot even think without language? Or
yeah, I think that's a good way to kind of connect Derrida and Haraway. I think what Haraway more is saying here is, I think it's important to point out, like the self is the one who is not dominated, who knows God by the service of the other is the one who holds the future. So we're trying to be the one who's like not dominated in this situation. We're trying to be the one who is kind of better than the other, who is over the other. But in trying to be the one independent of the other, we're kind of missing something there. Like, I think of it as like in terms of opposites. Like you can't have tall without being short. Like you can't have the concept of ugly like without having the concept of beautiful. Like there are these inherent kind of things that aren't only opposites of each other, opposites in air quotes, but also like fundamentally rely on each other to even exist in the first place. And I think that's kind of what she's saying here about the one and the other. Get him, Alex. Go register. But there's kind of like to be one is to be an illusion because you're incomplete. Because it's you want to be like this whole and this, you know, autonomous, powerful God, da 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 da. But you can't do that without the other. And so trying to dominate the other is solidifying yourself as incomplete and as in whole. Yeah.
Or also in this understanding that specifically with the self-other dichotomy, the self thinks of itself as autonomous. It thinks of itself as one. You know what I mean? Like maybe another way to think about it is like we in America think of ourselves as this nation that we are the way that we are because we're America, right? But fundamentally, it necessitates the exploitation of another. America is America because we exploit these third world countries in the global south, right? And we like to live in like this illusion of the self and the autonomy of the self. But necessarily, it's predicated on the exploitation of another that only that other is really aware of.
Like, to what extent is domination crucial here? Like, for example, I feel like, well, like US is like one of the example, but then I feel like there are some countries that doesn't have to exploit others. Well, I think they need a concept of others outside of the border, but they don't necessarily dominate over other. Can it be like equal, just distinguished and?
I think there are definitely like examples of that, right? And that's where it's interesting to point out like how Haraway's critique is different than the others. Haraway is writing specifically in the context of for this group of people, for people like in the U.S. and things like that. Haraway is specifically focused on domination of the other. That is her problem. If Derrida's problem is just like the illogical nature of it, Haraway is focused with the exploitation.
Oh, just adding on to that, could we say like it's not just linked to domination, but like this dualism of like separating the self and the other is also like, I think like in like a social level, like we rely on the objectification of other people in general to like further establish ourselves. I guess could you say that? So like it's not just about dominating, but it's also in the process of like domination, we're also solidifying the ego, the self that we're building on.
Yeah, that's perfect.
That's spot on. Did you get all the classes you wanted?
Yes.
Fire. Okay, so now we're going to move on to more Taoist critiques of these ideas that we've seen Western philosophers critique. And it's important to kind of go over these because I think they bring an entirely new perspective on what we've just talked about. But also, disclaimer, although we divide these things into critiques and solutions just to present on it and make it easier, these critiques and solutions are kind of both intertwined with each other, kind of in the very fact that like these Taoist texts are not only like these philosophical texts, but also these kind of religious texts, and also these like poetic texts, and that they're kind of literature as well. And so a lot of these ideas are both intertwined in each other. And so, again, although we divide these into critiques and solutions, you can see bits and pieces of critiques and solutions in every excerpt that we have. So first, I'm going to do a Taoist critique of logocentrism, and I think this is kind of the easiest one to see. We look at it and we do not see it. Its name is the invisible. We listen to it and do not hear it. Its name is the inaudible. We touch it and do not find it. Its name is the subtle. And these three cannot be further inquired into and hence merge into one. There's an inherent rejection of dualism and of logocentrism here as having separate things. We can't really have the one without the other because there's a fundamental similarity kind of linking these things together. And also in Taoist moral codes, right and wrong are always interconnected with each other, right? So focusing on this logocentric knowledge of these separate ideas and of these dualisms totally ignores this and takes us actually further away from the Tao in the first place. Pretending one is finding or discovering this new knowledge is not only inaccurate, but it's kind of irresponsible in this case. It takes us further from the thing we're supposed to get into, further from the way we're supposed to go. And I think that's exemplified in the second quote. For both Zhuangzi and Laozi, the ideal state of being is one in which there is no desire for knowledge or new experiences. This is because all concepts are mutually involved with their other, constituting each other. And clearly everything here is the one directly refuting logocentrism and dualism. And I also, quick sidebar, I want to say, there's a lot of literature out there about the Chinese language itself and logocentrism, and it's discussed a little bit in this article that I had out for today, but not a lot. And I think it's really interesting because a lot of what Derrida's critiques are about Western language comes from the fact that, like, these Western languages have this, like, Roman alphabet and, like, these systems that we've set in place. But a lot of that doesn't really apply to Chinese because there are obviously a character system, and a lot of these characters have different meanings and pronunciations depending on their context and usage, which is awesome, but not awesome for me who's trying to learn Chinese. But it throws so many different wrenches into this idea of logocentrism, which is cool. I would recommend checking it out. There are a lot of things that we couldn't put in this presentation because of time, but that's another also really cool way. And secondly, I want to talk about these Taoist critiques of dominations. And so in this quote, when the people of the world know beauty as beauty, there arises the recognition of ugliness. When they all know the good as good, there arises the recognition of evil. Therefore, being and non-being produce each other, difficult and easy complete each other, long and short contrast each other, high and low distinguish each other, sound and voice harmonize with each other, front and back follow each other. This is very, very similar to that quote we saw from Haraway, the first one at the beginning, where she's describing all of these dualisms as the one and the other. But we can see here that there's no kind of domination of one or the other under Daoism, because it all exists in this one, in this way. There's kind of a critique and a solution in here. Once we see that these things are inseparable, these dualisms become inaccurate. These things complete each other, contrast each other, but also distinguish, harmonize, follow each other, produce each other even. It becomes possible for us to act in a way that kind of acknowledges this. Once we acknowledge that everything is interconnected and that these dualisms are ultimately fake. And pay attention especially to this idea of recognition. There arises this recognition of ugliness, because I'm going to be talking about that a bit later. But the second quote kind of is our call to action then. To let go of such discriminations means to let go of dualistic moral codes as well. You don't need to be the one and dominate the other if you kind of recognize that foundationally we are all coming from and going to the same place. There's no kind of reason for us to make these distinctions, to make these divides, and to have these problems that we see if we let go, again, of these dualistic moral codes. And finally, there's a Taoist critique of this kind of idea of me as discrete, as myself as separate from the others, as humans, at the top of the food chain or whatever. And this kind of ties, obviously, to man and nature, like I said. It says, the Tao that can be Taoed is not the constant Tao. The name that can be named is not a constant name. Having no name is the source of heaven and earth. Having names is the mother of the 10,000 things. Therefore, when you do not have intention, you can see the wonder. When you have intention, you see the forms. And these two things have the same origin, although different in name. As you can see, we have the same origin as nature. The source of heaven and earth. We are inseparable. This heaven, or Tian in Chinese, ensures that we are inherently connected to this nature and what it represents for us. I think a lot of our problem that we have now is we see ourselves as the active, acting upon these passive objects. I do things to nature, and nature is stagnant. I can chop down a tree, the tree doesn't do anything. But actually, it's kind of impossible for us to do anything, the Taoists are saying, without ourselves being affected as well, because fundamentally we are all coming from the same place. No action that we can take distinguishes us from these things. We are not these separate beings. We are not these separate autonomous beings, because we're all fundamentally, again, the same. We're all in the Tao. And, yeah.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed this quote at the end that's kind of doing an analysis of this first part, because these are the first lines of the Tao Te Ching, right? And specifically, like, the odd number lines describe the nameless Tao, while the even number lines kind of describe these dualistic ways in which we understand the world, right? And so this is a perfect example of what we're talking about when the Taoist critiques and the Taoist solutions are going hand in hand. And bar by bar, we're changing from this understanding of non-dualism to this understanding of dualism, right? I think it's really good.
Yeah. And these are critiques and, like, also a little bit about solutions. We're going to get into more specific solutions very, very soon, as in the next slides. But for now, another discussion. Do you buy these critiques? Do you think they're better or worse than the Western critiques? Or do you think that they fill each other's blind spots anywhere that we've been talking about? Yeah.
It's funny, I think the U.S. has proposed equally a solution for the 4-7 debate. that we talked about earlier, like a necessitation of both these different sides in each other. Also, I wanted to bring up a concept that we may have talked about in this class, or maybe it was in one of the previous section, with the idea of like Indra's net of jewels, that we are all a reflection of each other. I really thought that really made a lot of sense when you're talking about like hurting the tree. The tree is not just a tree, but it's a reflection of you, and you're a reflection of the tree itself. Hurting it, you hurt yourself. You're all a part of this one big thing, you know. I guess that's sort of exemplified within this like longer metaphor. But yeah, anyways,
yeah. Any other thoughts? Cool. So first, there's this Taoist solution of Wu Wei. So we've established that dualisms are bad in very great detail. So should we abandon our search for any knowledge? Is all hope lost? Do we give up? Do we completely empty our minds? Well, Taoist solution says, of course not. We just need a different kind of knowledge. This isn't a rejection of all knowledge that we know, but it's kind of an embracing of this different kind of knowledge, which is Wu Wei. It's having, again, this no intention, this no dualistic moral codes that we see right now. We should rid ourselves of our very specific Western dualistic type of knowledge that we have right now in favor of Wu Wei. If we get rid of these ideas of beauty, of our perception of beauty, as you can recall, then we can get rid of our perception of ugliness as well. Therefore, the sage manages affairs without action and spreads doctrines without words. It's kind of this something and nothing both coming into play here. A quiet center that does not change while activity constantly and spontaneously occurs. A situation Chuang Tzu calls tranquility in disturbance. In this way, we re-achieve the simplicity of a child who is free from marks and does not take credit for what she does, because she does not have the sense of a self that does them. It is when we live in this fashion that all things flourish by themselves. So again, you can see kind of this contradiction here. There's no sense of self, but you can flourish by yourself if we do that. But it's because we're kind of rejecting this thing of seeing ourselves both as discrete and as dualistic. Not only are we rejecting, again, this other and one, this domination over things that we see as inherently lesser, but we're also kind of rejecting this idea that there is a self at all. But because of that, we can flourish in tandem with other things, We're kind of going to merge into one. It's a completion here, basically, by having Wu Wei. It says, for Lao Tzu, emptying the mind will not only extinguish human desires, but also return the world to a condition that precedes all such desires, and by implication preferences, since to desire something means necessarily not to desire an alternative. When we want this beauty, then that means we don't want this definition of ugliness. If we want this good, that means we don't want this definition of bad. But if we precede all such desires, if we totally empty our mind from these preferences and from these implications, then, again, we can extinguish these human desires and become somewhat and completely complete. All of this to say that Daoism kind of accepts this chaos and this oneness, while logocentrism and dualism rejects it. Chaos says that chaos and change is actually the most kind of stable condition of the world in a way. These contradictions and chaos don't make the world weaker, but actually it affirms the connection of everything that we see here in the status quo. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So the second solution is largely focused on Taoist mysticism, which we're going to spend a little bit of time on. There was a little bit in the readings that we had about Taoist mysticism, but it really piqued my interest, so I decided to really jump in and lean into it a little bit more. And I think it does a really good job of kind of posing a solution to these non-dualistic perspectives. I think one of the biggest things for me is when I'm looking at specifically Wu Wei, it's like, how is this thing a solution? This thing is a solution. It's a logical solution, right? It's something that we can think of in our head. It's an ideology. And I think almost necessarily to what Wu Wei's project is it can't be something that is just in the brain. It can't be just an idea that we have. It has to be it has to be an experiential thing. It has to be a body thing, and it has to be something that we understand not through logic, but through our own experience. So to do that, I'm going to talk a lot about mysticism. Just so we're all on the same page, the way in which I understand mysticism is seeking direct personal experience of a deeper reality or spiritual truth, often through practices like meditation or contemplation. The goal is achieving a deeper awareness with the divine and going beyond what we understand through logic, language, and ordinary experience. So I think first, it's important to understand what the project of Taoist mysticism is, and the type of Taoist mysticism that I'm going to mainly focus on is Taoist inner alchemy. So the goal here is a form of subtle body ecstasy. I think the important word there is body. When we understand what mysticism is, a lot of us, at least me personally, I have a Western perspective of what mysticism is, which is mainly focused on it's an experiential thing with your head, right? It's some place that you're going to. It's something other than the world, right? And a lot of times it's not involved with the body. But before we get to all that, it's important to understand how Taoist mysticism, in the way in which it's presented, is different than Western mysticism, right? The project in Western mysticism and the way that it kind of goes about things is it has these first-hand experiences. There's this dude that did all these cool things, and he's about to tell you what happened, right? A big example of this, one of the most famous mystics in the Christian tradition is Meister Eckhart, who was this 14th century Benedictine monk. And it's just him talking about these different experiences that he had. But it's totally autobiographical. It's totally just focusing on him and himself. This is really different from how we kind of like see the text of mysticism inside of Taoism working. A lot of most of the, like literally all the texts inside of mysticism up until when Western missionaries came and the Yuan and Ming dynasties, it's like a rule book. It's like, I enjoy it. It's like hubristic in this way. It's like, hey, we know how you're going to do this. Follow our rules. This is what's going to happen. It's very logical. It's step by step. And there's not a lot of like, this is what happened to me, right? It is more like we're a group that is doing this thing, and if you follow our specific instructions, this is what is going to happen, right? And so, yeah, a few more disclaimers before I get into what this looks like. I'm using one specific text here, and this text pulls on two things. First, it pulls on these other texts that I was talking about, these rule books, these guides, these manuscripts, and then later, it will pull on these more modern, more contemporary texts that are going to show experiential and autobiographical experiences. Again, with mysticism, it's something that is very subjective. It's something that is not particularly academic because it's trying to escape logic and language. And a lot of times when we're understanding these things, I'm not speaking on the entirety of Taoist mysticism. I'm talking about one very specific type of Taoist mysticism, one specific practice, that being inner alchemy, and I'm talking about a specific group of people who practice this in a very specific way. Okay, disclaimer's out of the way. We're going to jump into how Daoism understands the body when we're talking about mysticism. And so fundamentally, the thing that they're working with is qi, right? Which is at the root of everything that exists, whether natural, supernatural, human or non-human, animate or inanimate, right? And Daoism is going to separate this into two types of qis. First, primordial qi, and second, postnatal qi. Primordial qi, that's the shit. That's the good stuff. We like that stuff. Everybody has a little bit of it. It's the power of the universe at its creation. And yeah, we all have a little bit of it. Well, postnatal qi, it's kind of things that we can like put into our body. It's ingested through food, breath, and interaction with others. And it's also something that we are constantly losing. The way I like to think about it is if we think of like the decline and then the death of the body, that is the slow loss of postnatal qi, right? So the goal of these Taoist mystics is to harness that postnatal qi and to turn it into something more, right? To experience something with the body. So there's three levels of this qi. The first is Jing, which is the most tangible form of qi. And this is kind of difficult for me to understand, and it's still kind of tricky for me to wrap my head around. But I really like this quote: no longer the qi of the eggs in the omelet, and not yet the qi of the eggs is assimilated in the body of the eater. So it's kind of like the eggs going through your body and your digestive tract, just kind of like chilling out there. But it's not yet a part of you. It hasn't like absorbed into you. Then there's purified Jing, Jing that has been transformed, usually through different practices of meditation. And then finally Shen, or spirit, which is kind of like the goal. This is what we're getting at, right? It's the higher vitality of life, the power of consciousness, and it's the most impact on mystical transformation. Another way to understand it is spirit, but again, we're not creating a mind-body dichotomy here. We're not creating a spirit-body dichotomy. Spirit is just a part of me in the same way my arm or my leg is. Okay. So I've kind of been dancing around it. But Jing, as Taoist mystics understand it in the body, for men is semen and for women is menstrual blood. And so that's where these practices are going to start. Again, I gave us a lot of heads up before we started. But this is what mysticism is. It's leaning into these types of things. It's working outside of the barriers of language and logic, and it's kind of leaning into a lot of things that we might see as alienating. So what we're going to do is we're going to work through all 3 stages, and we're going to lean into it with good faith. We're going to steelman this argument. We're going to make it as good as possible. We're going to try to understand it as good as possible, and then afterwards we'll talk about it. Right? Okay. So for men, this looks like not losing semen through ejaculation, and for women, this looks like a series of meditations and breast massages that learn to lessen and eventually stop the flow of menstruation. Right? So once these practices are completed, once these rituals and meditations, once this no longer losing of semen happens, this Jing is going to move up through the spine towards the brain. Once it gets to the brain, and once it overflows, it will then move down to the abdomen into this field called the lower cinnabar field. Right? After more meditations and chanting, it will circulate around in here until it forms a little ball, right? Which they will call the mysterious pearl, or the pearl of dew, which will be the immortal embryo as it grows. Once the pearl of dew is in the lower cinnabar region, it's the end of the first stage. And again, when I'm talking about these things, there are texts that are just going through this very logically, very meticulously, very scientifically. After you do every single one of these things, this is going to happen, right? It's hubristic in that sense. I really enjoy it. The immortal embryo grows over 10 months in the lower cinnabar region, right? I like this quote. I don't fully understand it. Understood as the reversal of the cosmic process of creation, it involves reverting the 5 phases into the 3 primal forces: water, fire, and earth. So these are like long periods of meditation during these 10 months. And after the 10 months, adapts will enter a stage of deep absorption, lying immobile as if dead, appearing pale in complexion, and apparently not breathing at all. So they just kind of like clonk out, right? During this clonked out stage, it's really important that like they don't hear anything, they're not interacting with anything. A lot of the texts talk about like this being in caves, right? And while this is happening, they have a lot of practitioners around them, a lot of like, people who are very knowledgeable in this practice, kind of like doing these chants around them. After 5 days, the individual will wake up, and this is kind of seen as the completion of the growth of the immortal embryo. It's still in the lower cinnabar region now. After that happens, it will move back up through the spinal cord into the head. After this happens, with the eternal embryo now stationed in the head, the Shen, which is kind of like what this is also becoming, or what it is now, it's changed from Jing to purified Jing to Shen, will now exit the body, moving freely and returning to the body quickly. This quote at the end: after its exit, the spirit learns to come and go freely and to communicate widely with the other world. In the beginning, it moves rather slowly and does not travel far from the body. So maybe the first time it's just kind of like moving around, and the second time it's moving around humanities, and then moving around all of McAllister. Soon it's like flying around the celestial fields, right? Then, supported by further meditative exercises known as nursing for 3 years, it gradually gets used to its new powers, moves about faster and travels further afield until it goes far and wide without any limitation. So yeah, that's kind of like seen at the end of stage 2. And also at the end of stage 2, this is where we start getting to like when people have powers. So there's a lot of descriptions of like being able to teleport, being in 2 places at once, moving different elements, all fun stuff if you follow these rules. So stage 3 is kind of, there's the least amount of literature on it. And when I say least amount of literature, least amount of instructions, right? Again, we're talking about instructions. And this is kind of where we get into like the final goal of mysticism, where we get more and more into these things that are difficult to describe. If we're talking before about scientific things that we can place into words, this is getting to the point where it's very subjective. It's very fixated on the individual person, and that's why we don't have a lot of literature on this thing. Because like I was talking about, the culture of mysticism in the Chinese tradition until missionaries came was not to give subjective, experiential, autobiographical explanations of what's happening, right? So stage 3, it's categorized by wall gazing, which is adopted from Chan Buddhism, and it can take about 9 years. But again, it's incredibly subjective here. I really like this little piece here that kind of describes the end of the 3rd stage. All your tasks already well fulfilled. Just sit down in a corner, concentrate the spirit. Feel your body rest on purple clouds, your whole being calm, floating on weak waters. The chi forces meld together, yin and yang unite. Spirit, heaven, earth, all are one. Concluding the great work, you see the gate of jade emerging from the mists and heave a deep, long sigh. So yeah. So how is inner alchemy non-dualist, right? It's important to note that we've been talking about differences in mysticism purely from a practice standpoint, right? But what is the goal of Taoist mysticism, right? Taoist mysticism is different from Western religions, where the experience is at the pivot of it all and is described as overwhelming and ineffable. The key to being a Taoist mystic, then, is not whether one has a certain experience, but to what degree oneself is being transformed into cosmic dimensions, how sagely and non-acting one has become. I'm just going to keep going. Western traditions pose a transcendent divine agent, a God totally other. Their mystics accordingly concentrate on rare visions of the deity, granted through his mercy, that are overwhelming, ineffable, and entirely out of this world, entirely separate from this world. The Chinese tradition, on the other hand, sees its ultimate in the Tao, a divine force so immanent that it is even in the soil and the tiles, so much a part of the world that it cannot be separated from it. The goal of Taoist mysticism, unlike Western mysticism, is not to escape this world, to see something other than this world. It is to understand the world around us even more. The challenge for the mystic, then, is not to overcome the body in favor of the spirit, right? We're not creating this dichotomy between the body and the spirit, but to transform the entire body-spirit continuum to a higher level and come to experience himself as the divine replica of the cosmos in oneness with the Tao. It is not that we're separating ourselves from the world, but that we're coming to understand our deep, deep relationship with the world. We're not splitting it into two. We're pushing it into one. And I think that's how it's non-dualist, because it's not separating us from it. It's showing us how deeply related we are. So yeah, that's Taoist mysticism. That's Wu Wei. Those are our solutions that we found. What do you guys think? Do you guys buy these solutions? How are we feeling about them? Yeah.
Could you reiterate that last slide? I was still confused by how mysticism ties in.
Yeah.
To,
Yeah. So kind of the critique we've been leveling is this one of dualism, that we don't enjoy, right? And so understanding what the project of mysticism is. The way that I think about it is the Western perspective of mysticism is it's specifically focused on this mind-body dichotomy, and it's specifically focused on this nature-culture dichotomy, right? And the goal with Western mysticism is to entirely separate yourself from nature and from your body. And in some ways, and in that way, it's somewhat of a normative claim, like our body is bad and this other thing is good. But it also furthers this dichotomy and this dualism that we've been really critical of. Instead, inner alchemy is focused with understanding the world around you better, understanding your experience with it, how you're directly related to it. And it's not a separation of the spirit. It's coming to understand your body all as one, right? Sees its ultimate in the Tao, divine force so immanent that it's even in the soil and tiles, so much a part of the world that it cannot be separated from it, right? Like that, the it here is the body, right? The challenge for the mystic is not to overcome the body in favor of the spirit, but to transform the entire body-spirit continuum to a higher level and come to experience himself as the divine replica of the cosmos and oneness with the Tao. I really like that, like, again, like some of this is kind of be alienating, like cosmos is kind of like an alienating word for me, but the way in which I'm understanding this is like you're so much a part of the world that you're a replica of the cosmos, like you're so intertwined with it that you're in this kind of state. Yeah.
Is that the divine replica of the cosmos, is that part of what happens when you go through the practice that you described?
Yeah. So again,
that's somehow becoming a replica of the cosmos through chi.
Exactly. Yeah. And how deeply experiential that is. It's not something that we can like logically think of. Like, oh yeah, I'm the replica of the cosmos. It is something you have to experience. You have to go through all of these things. You have to go through this very scientific, this very practical, this very like step-by-step process to get that.
I buy it. I also have a question, I guess, for more so for Colette, I think. Especially like in Asian languages specifically, like have you seen kind of a non-dualism in there, especially when it comes to like subject-verb like structure in language?
Yeah, I think so. I think when it comes to like subject and verb structure, like I think first and foremost of like the Chinese word ta, that can mean like he, she, it, like whatever. Like there's kind of no distinguishation there. I think from the very little I've studied, I'm not gonna like pretend like I'm fluent or anything, but I think it is interesting kind of how it structures itself and like the way that like a lot of actions and tenses are kind of posed as like, I don't know, like there's like verbs are usually like object action. And so it's like trying to like combine those things kind of into one kind of like idea instead of just being like run. It's like two words, like two characters. One is the actual object and one is like the actual verb. And so I think that's kind of a way to see it. But yeah, there's a lot of like texts out there about that, and I would recommend checking it out. I think some of them are cool. I haven't fully gone down that rabbit hole, but I would recommend.
Yeah, I definitely think it's really interesting when you talk about this like the logocentric that comes from like language that Gary was originally talking about. Especially the difference between like Romance and Latin languages versus like Eastern languages. There is quite a big difference about how sentences are structured and how that actually interacts and how people see each other. Like Eastern languages are often described as being very relational. Like you talk about them always, you talk about other people in context. You know, it's not about me. It's about like my relation to you. You know, I don't know. That's something that I've seen a lot, especially in Korean. So that's why I bring that up. Is that it is very interesting that non-dualism seems almost like baked into the language. So, yeah.
I can talk a bit about Chinese. Like a lot of characters they inherently like multi-meaning. Depending on context and that, they have like different meanings. That's why when we have all these translations, sometimes we have like the heart mind, like the name fame thing, but like they're actually just like one character, but like the character itself has a lot of different meanings depending on how you use it, and or not depending, or like it just does have all these complex meanings within them, and I think that's very like non-dualism, very like anti-logocentric.
Yeah, I think especially like with Shin, like heart, mind, kind of in one. That's a really cool example for sure.
And I mean, like as a Chinese, I can say that if we forget about the academic part, then when we are talking about our ordinary language, there's nothing like a grammar in English. For example, like for even basic English, in our ordinary like discussions, we will include a subject, a verb, and a action or the other stuff that we do. But in Chinese, there's not at all. Sometimes, for example, like if I said I want to go, that's how I talk in English. But in Chinese, I just said 走了. Basically walk.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, so we've talked a lot about this. You steelmanned a lot of it, and so I think I'm going to go now, and then Alex, into our criticisms of, do we actually think this works? Do we think this solves any problem? Have we actually accomplished anything here in like the hour that we presented? And I do think that dualisms, sorry guys, I think they're stupid. And I think that a lot of Western philosophy poses these things as critiques, but less in solutions. I think especially like in Haraway and in Derrida and Latour to an extent, there's kind of a sense of hopelessness there, at least like foundationally, being like, okay, these are problems that we're facing in the status quo. That's because of dualism. Wow, it really sucks. And especially I think in Derrida, who poses like no solution to this and saying like, because of the way that like our society is structured and because the way like we communicate in language, there's absolutely no solution. Or the solutions are flawed. Like Haraway talks about the solution of all of these things being the cyborg, which is wrong. And Latour also goes into solutions, which I also disagree with. But also the solution to man and nature here is definitely something that is not only like hypothetical, but like I said, very tangible. And I think that Daoism finds a lot more connections and solutions where Western philosophy fails. And so that's why I kind of think it's so important to examine these things not only from a Western point of view, but from these other philosophies as well. And although we've said that this is a very contemporary problem in Western philosophy that's anti-dualist, I mean, these Taoist texts are so much older. Like, these things are coming from, hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. And it just shows that, like, we've been kind of dealing with the same problem since the beginning of time. But if we actually take a look at, what other perspectives have to say and try to kind of bridge these gaps, then there can be ways that we can interpret things in these modern conversations. Okay, do I think that mysticism is the solution to all of these problems? Am I going to go through step by step and try to do Alex's scientific method to control water? I don't think so. But also, I do think that there is a very good idea in trying to connect ourselves with the universe and trying to dename and deconstruct these structures that we have of naming and of conventions. And I think there definitely is something very valuable in that, not only as in the mind, I guess, in Wu Wei are thinking, but also in these more mystic traditions of trying to connect this mind-body and trying to actually take this anti-dualism to heart. I think to reject the dualities, there is a good idea here of embracing both sides. It must be all encompassed. That's really the only way that we can get rid of these things. And I think encompassing it into nothing by Wu Wei is kind of the point. It has to be nothing in order to be something, in order to be one in the first place. And I think that definitely, that's where the biggest bridge has to be crossed with these more Western reason-based solutions and these kind of more Eastern mystic ones. But I do think it could be very wonderful to try to bridge it and connect it. And I think the traditions and language of Chinese, like we've been saying over and over again, make these texts especially dense and rich, and in a way that a lot of Western people will not be able to fully understand, because there are so many different contextual meanings, not only to these characters, but to also the historical aspects of it as well. But I do think that shouldn't discourage us from studying these things in the first place. Basically, I think that these things aren't directly comparable with Eastern and Western traditions. I don't think they're really the same, but I do think that both of these can work in tandem with each other to try to further these projects that we've been seeing, again, for thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Wu Wei. I really like it. I really enjoy it. I think it does a really good job of kind of posing a solution to to dualism. I spent a lot of time with Latour last year, and I think his solution is facing Gaia. That's the term he gives it. And I think in some ways it's very similar to Wu Wei, but I think Wu Wei goes a lot further than that. And I definitely think Wu Wei is the best of the three solutions we see. Best of the four solutions. The Western solutions are good. I want to focus a little bit on mysticism for a while, since I steelmanned it so hard. These are three people that I looked into that kind of give some first-hand accounts, or at least closer to first-hand accounts, of what this mysticism and this experience might have looked like. I think for me, coming from a Western perspective, it was in some ways really, and I'm a big fan of religious studies and mysticism, but it was very alienating to kind of see a form of mysticism that only showed itself through the step-by-step process. I think the experiential or the autobiographical lens that Western mysticism takes was very important and developmental to my understanding and appreciation of mysticism, and in that way is very alienating. And so I was very happy to kind of read more about these three specific people and to kind of understand their specific experiences. And the first two were really good. I really enjoyed them. I thought they were very helpful, and they. Let's take that. And I really enjoyed them. This third guy, I don't really like that much. There was this big article that I was using for most of my work on this concept, and she used these three people. But Michael Wynn was the person that she talked about the most. This is Michael Wynn. He's just some white dude. I think it's important when we're talking about religious mysticism and the culture that is inherently present in that. It's very difficult for somebody who's not a part of that culture to come in and to fully understand it and to fully take it for what it all is. This is another picture of Michael Wynn. He has a YouTube channel, about 4K subscribers. He's a goofy guy for sure. When we get into mysticism, we're obviously stepping away from academia. We're stepping away from a lot of the pros of academia to lean into some of the problems with academia. And Michael really enjoys his YouTube videos. I think also, when we understand the subjective experience of mysticism, when we understand that it's something that we kind of have to lean into and to buy into about individual people, a lot of times when we take people with good faith, we kind of get rid of a lot of the room from maybe the fact, for the idea that maybe they got some stuff wrong here. that maybe there's some problems in their types of thinking, and that maybe, although subjectivity is a powerful way to understand the world, there's flaws in it. This video by Michael really alienated me. Thank you. Thank you. I think at best we can understand Michael to be somebody who saw another culture that was saying something about the world that he hadn't really seen or understood or saw in other modes of conception, that he leaned into maybe a little too quickly and curiously, and kind of took some wrong things out of it. I think at best we can understand Michael Wynn as deeply fetishizing a culture that he does not understand and that he never will understand, thinking that he has the hubris to talk about these things in a way that other people haven't talked about. I do not like this person. I do not respect this person. I'm not happy that he was included in this article. I think it does a shame to mysticism, and I think specifically it does a deep, deep shame to Taoist mysticism. So yeah. That was really rough for me. I didn't like figuring that out. I didn't like that article didn't say anything about that. And again, that's the nature of mysticism. That's what happens. I think a lot of it is still really valuable. I think subjective experiences are really important. I think truth outside of academia is super important. And I think a lot of time academia kind of has this raised brow and kind of brushes it aside when it can show a lot of truth about our world that academia just can't. So that's one of my criticisms. My other criticism is going to be talking a little bit more about Wu Wei, talking a little bit more about the things that I value in this world, and how we understand these things through the lens of non-dualism. So yeah, in a non-dualist lens, how do we understand love? How do we understand compassion? How do we understand empathy? Are these feelings that can exist inside the Taoist framework of non-duality? I think at first when I looked at this, I was like, no, they can't, right? Part of Wu Wei is kind of the understanding that thought experiments or thinking about things is in some way flawed, and that the idea of love kind of necessitates hate, right? At least I think in how we understand it in the West, right? The opposite of love is hate. I think doing a little bit more research on Daoism and non-duality, I think I came to a definition of love that I really enjoy, a definition of compassion and empathy that I really enjoy, and I think definitions of these things that reflect non-duality, and also in mysticism, the project of understanding yourself as deeply, deeply related, experientially related to the world around us. Love is to be one with the Tao. I think plain and simple. I really enjoyed this quote, so I'm just going to read it out loud. Then perhaps what we understand as love is the effective aspect of a non-dual ontological realization, the experience that I am not other than the beloved. Thank you. So yeah, it's for today.
Do you want to take a few questions?
Yeah.
Questions, comments, concerns? YouTube video recommendation?
Well, I have a question. I got two questions, but one of them is kind of fast, and then the so Alex, we were talking a bit during our discussion of Daoism earlier in the class, like trying to make the distinction between philosophical Daoism and the practices of Daoism.
Yeah.
So thanks for going down that road that I didn't want to go down earlier in class. And there's also interesting questions about the influence of the internet. So Daoism plus the internet obviously leads to some, interesting results. But do you think, like having done your research around mysticism, do you think that it makes sense to talk about, try to make that distinction between a philosophical Daoism versus a practical or practice-based Daoism? Are they really aspects of the same thing, or any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think again, like I'm a philosophy and religious studies person. That's what I study. I think a lot of times philosophy likes to think of itself as purely logic choppy, as not at all influenced by culture or the world around us. And a lot of times it's this thing kind of like separate from the people who practice it. in my understanding, I think of philosophy and religious studies as kind of like one and the same thing. And I think a lot of times what we understand as canon can be a little problematic. And I think looking at how lay people interact with specific ideologies and specific texts are super important. And so I think that's where my connection with mysticism comes in. I think everybody has an internal logic that in some ways is predicated on different forms of dogma, whether that's philosophical dogma or religious dogma. And then it's also kind of taking their own experience, kind of using their own modes of logic by the culture that they live in and the context of their own life. So I think for me, I see them as one and the same. I see them as very similar. I see them as both having logic that is in some way flawed, in some way not, that we respect because it's things that people believe.
So my question more on Colette's side of the presentation. So I think you do a good job throughout of kind of showing us maybe how the philosophical ideas and authors that you gave us maybe are doing something that sort of looks like what Taoists are thinking. So I saw quite a few comparisons, but I guess my question would be, what do you think is the biggest difference between the philosophers you discuss and the Taoists?
I think probably first and foremost, just like the historical context and the traditions that they're actually coming from in the first place. Like I think kind of this idea of like deconstruction or the movement of deconstruction is like a totally different thing and is coming from like totally different context and like has different goals in mind than these more Taoist texts. And I do think that although they end up kind of making a lot of similar comparisons and a lot of, similar critiques from each other, I think that they do so from fundamentally different like baseline understandings of the world. And I think you can kind of see that in the way that like Daoism talks about the world in terms of like the oneness and the way, and in terms of how like Derrida talks about the world as like more kind of logically constructed from these things that have like existed like language. And I do think that overall like those cultural differences are very stark. And Derrida like straight up like dismisses like a lot of like Eastern languages and are like, we're not worried about this right now. And it's like, okay, well, great, thanks. And so I think that definitely, like, because of that, both sides can feel a bit alienated from each other, even though, again, a lot of their comparisons and critiques are very similar.
There's a comment about the mysticism part, the internal alchemy thing. It's overall legit, like what you presented. The only thing I couldn't find the Chinese like thing that relates to it is the three primordial force. I think that was the only like part about it, but like the rest of it is pretty legit.
Yeah, and I think kind of like the understanding there is this type of mysticism is pretty subjective, and also again, if the person who's writing this is she's a white lady from Hungary, and if your main source is Michael Wynn, I think maybe sometimes you're gonna have some problems. But again, the way in which I understand that is it's much less academic and much more talking with individual people and individual opinions. And so in no way was that Taoist mysticism little thing I did supposed to be all-encompassing for all of it. It was a very specific set of individuals that subjectively interact with these texts in a subjective way. And that's what I'm showing.
It's interesting, though, because you can find people, contemporary people, and now they're on the internet, practicing these various ancient philosophies, because I was once teaching an ancient philosophy class, and we were doing pre-Socratic philosophers, and ended up, for some reason, Googling around about sort of neo-Pythagoreans that exist. So they're still around, but
they're crazy.
Yeah, I mean, so they're allegedly inspired by what the historical Pythagoreans, who did live in communities and do some stuff like kind of like we were talking about the Moists, right? I mean, so there are historical examples of people living in these according to these philosophies, but yeah, you can find the contemporary interpretations which are pretty wild and and somewhat problematic in terms of what people are doing with these ideas. So
yeah, there's some pretty crazy like ancient Greek interpretations, especially when it comes to like not only Pythagoreans but like Stoics as well.
Stoics are really in right now. So
it's in like a very specific sect, which is odd because usually it's like I don't know, like ultra like misogynistic men who are like, I get up and I meditate for like 5 hours and then I go on like 20 business calls and it's like that's not what that's for.
There's Minnesota Stoic Society that you can join. Some of who do philosophy, some of who so there's some invasion of Stoicism into business, for sure.
Yeah, if anyone has like an ancient Greek like statue as their profile picture on Twitter, I'm already wary.
But that was also kind of one of our themes for the course was like what are the influences of these philosophies, contemporary and outside of their Asian context. So that was interesting to think about too. But anyone else have comments or questions?
I guess I have one last comment just for the end. I really appreciate you guys talking about working with authors who are working with translations of stuff. I think especially when we're talking about Eastern philosophy, it's more to truly account for stuff like that, and also there is this deep fetishization with especially Eastern philosophies that is going on online specifically. Like we said about Stoicism too, fascist Stoicism, how do they show up? And it's literally weird crap like this online, you know what I mean? But still, you guys presented the information in a very great way. So
Thank you.